So, thank you all for coming. I mean, we had a lot of. Anyway, I'll let Olivier introduce and then you take it out.
Yeah, so thank you for coming to this 119 CPR-CSH workshop. To be honest, we were not expecting that many people. I guess having Parto talking is helping us to gather people around a very important question about urbanization, of course. So Parto, you make things easier, indeed, as Mukhtar, because I don't need to remind you the rules, since you are one of the few who created these rules. So I will just let you talk and tell us more about your fascinating presentation.
Thank you all for showing up, because when we the rule at this workshop is we hold it to the last working Tuesday of every month. We started with the last Tuesday and then changed to the last working Tuesday, I think soon in the second year, because we found out that there's some Tuesdays which are holidays. But then this Tuesday turned out to be a Tuesday which was almost a holiday, but not quite. And so we decided what we were trying to do, and we felt it would be unfair to have a presenter come in and face a holiday crowd, and instead of breaking tradition, since we are now in a relatively ideological country, I decided to follow my own ideology and ensure that we hold on to tradition. Right? That's what we have been taught to do. So that's what we are currently doing. I'm so glad that all of you have showed up here. So let me begin. What this talk is going to be about is broadly, is very much work in progress. And the idea is to try and understand how we should think about urbanization going forward, based on what we have been. So it draws upon a lot of work here at CPR and some from colleagues associated and affiliated with us, and some of my own work. So let me begin by first looking at this map, which, as you will notice, is essentially a map of the villages of India. And if you notice the density of that settlement, if density were the only criteria for urbanization, we'd have one city stretching all the way from, let's say, Kolkata all the way up to Amritsar. It would be one large agglomeration, many times the size of the Tokyo-Osaka corridor, right? But that's not how we do it. And how we do it, of course, we'll be talking about, and the consequences of doing that is something that we can take out further. So let me begin by my favorite description of cities, which comes from a book by Terry Pratchett, simply passed on, called Mort. And I'll let you read that, because I find it evocative of what cities are about, and I also find it to be not so distant from what an Indian city might actually be like. And fundamentally, I think I find full of life as an old cheese on a hot day, and sheer exuberant busyness as a dead dog on a termite mound, is more or less how I think of cities, as places where there is activity, where there is movement, where people are engaged in doing something productive, in this case, the termites demolishing a dead dog, and it need not necessarily be very pretty. And that's the fundamental thrust about cities. The aesthetics is something one is willing to sacrifice its personal level, for the functionality of cities, and it partly, I suppose, comes from my training. And it's also, I don't know whether you could read this bit here. It says, Ankh-Morpork is composed of a rich Ankh and a poor Morpork, separated by the river Ankh, which is the most polluted waterway on the disk world, which is not a bad description of East and West Delhi. So, where do we go from here? First of all, I need to figure out how this thing works, because I don't think it's working. So somebody will have to figure out how this thing works, and unless there is, I'll just use this particular, there should be some kind of a device that will link to that, but I guess it's not there. No, it's fine, I can use it, but I'm more concerned about the fact that there should be something like this around somewhere. Okay, so why unthinking, right? The two ways I'm going to look at unthinking in this particular front is one, as an adjective, which is to say that Indian urbanization is unthinking, thoughtless in some sense. And the other is as a verb for us to do, in the sense of we need to rethink the way that we have thought about urbanization so far, which in this sense is a mixture of unlearning and rethinking. So that's how we get the two senses in which I'm thinking about unthinking going forward. Sure, I'll come back to the 1-minute summary later, because I think I've already given that to you. This is the broad, I'll skip since this room is here and we're short of time. I'm happy to come back to this. The core point of this slide is that if you look at the definition of urban in 1872 and 1881, which is the first census, you're looking at a collection of numerous dwellings near each other with a limited area having shops, which provide a continual open market for the supply of goods, especially of manufactured goods. It has both density and economic activity, as well as a population of a settlement of 5,000, the same level that we continue to use today. So all the ingredients that go into today's definition of urbanization, density, size, and economic activity, essentially is there right at the beginning when the census starts defining urban way back in 1881. And lest you think that 5,000 is a bad number, I'm just curious how they came up with that number in those days. Because today, if you look at urban clusters in the US, which is the core definition of urbanization, the next one being the metropolitan area, that urban cluster population is 2,500. So our threshold for urban is twice the level at which the US threshold is set. And it was set, that threshold was set way back over 130 years ago. Right? 150 years ago, yes. So, and that's which gives the Indian urban a particular form. And so if I only looked at size of 5,000, the Indian urbanization rate would be about 47%. If I only looked at density, it would be about 69%. 400 per square kilometer, exactly the same level as that of the US. If I looked at both size and density, it would be about 44%. Right? So if I leave out economic activity, that's where we are sort of headed in some sense. So that's just to give you a sense of when we start thinking about urban, the specific definition matters. And the 30% urban that we all sort of talk about is really something that we created. And that's just as easily uncreated. And if you use a Mexican definition, India would be far more urban. If you use a US definition, India would be far more urban. So the question is how urban India is can very well be changed depending on how you change those definitions. And may I remind you that countries change definitions all the time. The Chinese have changed definitions about thrice in the last 30 years. Every census they use a new definition and the urbanization rate goes up. Right? But that's just a number. What meaning does it have? And what I'll do is basically walk through very quickly 3 disciplines about which I have no knowledge and which I therefore say I'm caricaturing disciplines are doing. I do have colleagues who work in these disciplines and therefore they will all get very upset with me for what I'm just about to tell them. But broadly speaking, I found the wonderful device that will allow me to do various kinds of things. So let me try and do that while I'm doing this. So I'm going to be working on geography, which looks broadly at, built-up areas, broadly speaking. This is something, think about geography, defining urban. For example, the French, and this is work that we have done with Eric Denis and Kamla Marias Nanu and Marian Nzera and so on. They use contiguity of built-up areas as one definition of urbanization. And we'll try and see what that difference that makes. But obviously, within geography now, there is a lot more than physicality, right? There is aesthetics, there is power, there is mode of production, there is lots of other stuff about which I know absolutely nothing. And therefore, I will not go into that and restrict myself to the idea of being geography as built up, and that's the caricature. Modernization as sociology, and I'm sure Patrick will sort of say that is absolute bunkum. Contestation in politics. Are these spaces contested? And then in economics, we're looking at agglomeration and transition of work, and there I'll spend a little bit more of time looking at some of the work that we have done here. Right? So again, on this, as I said, we draw upon Eric and Kamla's work. And fundamentally, one of the key questions that I would say is way back, well before all of this, in 2008, for the 2009 World Development Report, Uchida and Nelson tried to figure out how many people live within a commuting distance of an urban cluster. And they picked 2, one which is 50,000, which is the definition of the standard metropolitan statistical area in the US, and the other of 100,000, which is a class 1 city in India, right? And they found out that 52% of people live within an hour's commute of a 50,000 town. Right? This is the time when the official urbanization rate was about 28%. They did the same thing in China. And China, that number, the official number was 36. And when they made these adjustments, the adjusted number also came out to be about 36. So if you use that definition, for instance, the question is India more urban than China? Again, as I said, these are, again, essentially about numbers. And using Denis and Kamla's work, you find out that India is about 45% in these kinds of large agglomerations of contiguous built-up areas. In a place like Bihar, for instance, that number goes from about 10% to over 30% when you shift definitions. Most of these settlements are, however, are all very agrarian in character. And if you go back to the original definition, when they were looking at structures in place, you'll see that in 1891, the census officer is saying that a place should not merely be a large village, but should have a distinct urban character. And this is to exclude a considerable number of large aggregates of homesteads on the Malabar coast, which are merely revenue units of a purely agrestic character. There's only agriculture and people. Hence, even if there's a lot of people, it doesn't qualify as a city or a town. So it's undesirable to classify as town overgrown villages which have no urban characteristics, whatever urban characteristics might mean. So, therefore, you could argue that these are very far away from the Malabar coast, but still roughly similar in its character, and therefore not something that we should be looking into. But that's something that we can discuss down the line, right? And this gives you a structure of that particular story. The second, and this draws upon work by Sumitra Badrinathan, Devesh Kapoor, and Megan Reed, who drew upon a survey that was coordinated by my colleague Nilanjan Sarkar, who's also now at Ashoka University. And this is a survey of about 5,000 households, the people who have worked in the survey in this room, and they'll correct me when I get those numbers wrong. About 3,000 of them from the National Capital Territory of Delhi, and another 2,000 from the National Capital Region, but urban areas in the National Capital Region. Right? So you ask these 5,000 households a number of questions. I'm picking out 3 aspects of it to showcase in this particular presentation. The first is, would you invite a scheduled caste, scheduled tribe person home for a meal? 43% of people say no. Right? We can question this in the sense that what is the control? Would you invite anyone home for a meal? Inviting people home for a meal is not a particularly sort of hugely prevalent practice. But that's what we have from that particular survey. The second is the acceptability of intermarriage. Over here is the poorest and here is the wealthiest, using, they don't ask for income, but they construct a wealth index based on a variety of information that's there in the survey. And trust me, I think it's pretty good. And this is the probability of acceptability. The top number here is 10%, that's 8%, 6%, 4%, 2%. The dotted line at the bottom, which you can hardly see, is religion. That goes from about 1% to about 2.5% in terms of acceptability of marrying somebody from another religion. Caste, by the time we have got up to the wealthiest household, it's up to about 6%. About the same that you have with language. Class, somewhere between religion and caste. Fundamentally, let me hold on to this question because let me put out the next kind of story here, which is they looked at 3 respondents. Now, that's okay, let's stay there. They don't want me to show that for some reason, unless it's some kind of a, it's not on a timer, okay. Interesting. Nah. Okay. So you might want to just have to hold that back up in some place. It's like a flash drive. Thanks, Olivia. It's sorry. Okay. Quickly,
please.
Yes, very quickly. The basic thing is, they asked, how were your parents married? How were you married? And what do you expect your children to do? Your parents and themselves, both of them were arranged by their parents. and they expect that their children would have what is called, self-arranged marriages. And a self-arranged marriage is basically the parent chooses, but the child approves. Everything else, where the child has some choice, is about 10%. So the question, therefore, is, if you're looking at modernization in some sense, are these quote-unquote modern attitudes? You're talking about the biggest agglomeration in this country, and these are the attitudes of people within this agglomeration. And which is why the question that I put out in the blurb is, are our cities urban? Okay, so that's the first thing to think of. I think it stays there. Okay, right? Smart, Olivia, thank you. So, as I said, as you can see, this brown is self-arranged, and the gray is, no, forget it. We'll move on, right?
I did what I could, huh?
Yes. This, on the other hand, is work that's done by Pranav Sidhwani, who was here an hour ago. He's no longer with us, he's somewhere else. But early work that started on segregation within Indian cities, looking at our larger cities, and we used what we call the Disparity Index. This is the proportion of people who have to move if you have to equalize the ratio of scheduled tribes and caste across different wards of a city. Since then, we have had Andalib Rahman, who is currently at Cornell, present his work here at CPR on much more detailed structures in this area, coming up with stronger numbers. Fundamentally, these numbers are high, not as high as race in the US, but high. On the other hand, they're lower than if you had to give people equivalent access to, let's say, in-house toilets. This is all from 2011. Obviously, since Swachh Bharat Mission, those differences have all disappeared. Think of it as in-house drinking water or social class, which is two-wheelers. So fundamentally, as far as cities are concerned, service provision is related to concentration of historically disadvantaged populations. The bottom line being space does matter, and caste might still matter in a specific way that we have told you about, right? Let me now move to political science and contestation. And this draws upon early work here by Bhanu, Joshi, and Arundhati, former colleagues here at CPR. And so we looked at turnouts in assembly elections and local elections. And what you find is urban turnout is almost consistently lower than rural turnouts across different states in elections. And this is more true of local body elections than assembly elections. In case you're worried about, we economists would always, everybody actually would worry about, these are not comparable, they're different spaces, etc., etc. So looked at, this is work by, as I said, Bhanu and Arundhati, and they looked at the city of Hyderabad, matching for exactly the same geographies and constituencies. And what you find is obviously that the local body turnout is consistently lower than the turnout in the assembly elections. So, are these cities spaces of electoral contestation? We have recently seen over the last month or so that cities still retain a space for political contestation. The question is whether or not they are similarly spaces for electoral contestation. At this point in time, that does not seem to be the case. We shall see how these kinds of things change over time, but definitely not that particular story. And because they are not particularly large spaces for electoral contestation, what you do have is that the amount of resources that the local government has is very low. Right? So this gives you the local government expenditure is how much of the government's expenditure is actually spent by local governments, total government expenditure across all levels of government. This draws upon work by Xu Fei, and in China that's about half. In India that's about 3%. So when people talk about Bombay being Shanghai, it's useful to remember that Shanghai has a lot more autonomy than Bombay ever did or will. Though Bombay is slightly better than that as far as relationship to Maharashtra would be concerned, but still far below the levels that we have looked at in China, right? So, and I will like you to hold this particular thing as we go forward and to ask a particular question. Right. Let me now turn quickly to present one fact before I put on something else, and I'll tell you why this odd sort of slide comes in a second. So this looks at the rise of contract labor in India, and you're looking at basically across different types of firms, by sizes of firms, these are the larger firms, and by degrees of restrictions. It draws upon work by Maria Bertrand, CA, and Sivanidis. And fundamentally, over time, there has been a large rise in the use of contract workers. What difference does it make for urbanization, you ask? What I'll ask you to remember is two other things that we have sort of figured out, or at least have argued, of course, open for contestation. One is that there is a fairly large social distance in Indian cities, given that social categories matter considerably in human interactions. And secondly, that local governments are actually quite lack agency. They're unable to do very much by themselves. So if you put these three things together, the question is, can Indian cities actually fulfill the core function that cities are supposed to fulfill in economic terms? They're supposed to be places of agglomeration, and they're supposed to be places where new knowledge is generated. These are supposed to be the places of innovation. In that sense, cities are seen as engines of growth. But for that, how does that innovation happen, and why is a city important for that innovation? That innovation happens largely because it's supposed to be about serendipitous and dense interactions. It's a place like this, lots of people get together, you hear this talk, hopefully some idea strikes you, I can't think why. You talk about it with somebody else, and in the middle of that interaction, a new idea springs up. For that to happen, and for that to be carried on, what you need is three kinds of things. You need people to talk to each other. And we found out that in Indian cities, that may not happen very much across classes. Within groups, yes, but not across. And that sort of limits the number of interactions that will actually take place. Two, that knowledge is therefore embedded in labor and in people, and you want that thing to continue over time, to grow, learning by doing, feedback loops. That feedback loop is constrained because you have contract labor, and therefore you're not investing A, in that labor, and B, that labor is not staying with that firm for a long time to receive that embedded knowledge. And 3, because your city is unable to take decisions for itself, you'd rather build a metro rail than a bus system or better auto rickshaw systems, for instance. You would have a situation where it's difficult for a city to solve the problems of firms, whether it's respect to availability of land. You must remember that one of the ways Gurgaon got its start was because when GE came to Delhi, DDA refused to believe that they would actually invest that much money and said, why don't you just hire some building space in one of these towers? And we've heard a lot of people who say they'll build factories which will employ 10,000 people, but for the moment, just start off with hiring space. Fortunately, there was Gurgaon at that point in time, or unfortunately, depending on what your perspective on Gurgaon is. And you have currently a certain hub of economic activity that has emerged out of those decisions. But those are not the kinds of decisions that cities can take. Right? Land is controlled by the state. Security is controlled by the state. In most of our cities, which don't have bus services, recently you had the strike in Telangana. That transport company is controlled by the state. So it's difficult for a city to actually solve the problems of the firm. It's difficult for a city to actually build educational institutions. The government in Delhi now is thinking of a specialized university, and that's largely because as the government of the National Capital Territory of Delhi, they have a certain degree of autonomy which other governments don't have, and therefore able to invest in these kinds of things. But cities don't usually have that ability, whereas let's say we have San Francisco State University, structures, etc., City University of New York, which is doing a whole bunch of stuff in that space. And even in terms of looking at living conditions of housing for workers, etc., it's not clear that the city has that much leeway, especially most smaller Indian cities, right? So the ability of a city to act as a knowledge driver, as an engine of growth in that sense, is severely constrained within the Indian conditions. So that's one of the first things I'd like to, on the economic stuff that I could think of, right? So I call them engines without drivers. Now, let me now switch gears and go back to what I started with, which is the issue of, this is morely, the whole issue of where exactly this whole urbanization story and the transformation story taking place. Right? The first thing that, this is standard stuff for people who do this stuff, is Indian urbanization is not about people moving from villages to cities, even though all the political discourse would seem to make it that way. This is more about, this is the amount of natural growth. This is the amount that goes to census towns, and work, of course, here began with Kanu's early work in 2012. This is the total migration. The number of people who moved from villages to cities was about 32 million, about the same as the number of people in in-situ towns. But about 11 million people moved back to villages. And most of those people who moved back to villages, we're still looking at these things, but they are moving back to villages, to districts which are actually quite urbanized in some. So this could be part of the Chinese phenomena of leaving the big city and going back to a smaller town, but it's something that we need to, or peripheries of smaller towns in those particular areas. We need to start thinking about that particular story a bit more. But the net story is that the story of Indian urbanization is not so much about migration as it is about change in occupational patterns in existing settlements. Right? And there is that difference across states. Most of Kerala, remember the old agrestic settlements on the Malabar coast? That's the old agrestic settlements on the Malabar coast, which now have acquired quote-unquote urban characteristics, and therefore has pushed the Kerala urbanization from 24% to about 45%. That's also true of Bengal, a bit of Jharkhand, variety of structures in that place. The core issue, and compared to China, that means that where migration is about 2/3, in India it's less than a quarter. The other story that is important for us to realize is that while the share of million-plus towns has gone up in India, if you look at the old million-plus towns, which were there in 2001, their share actually dropped. So it isn't the old, there is agglomeration taking place, but is not taking place at the old settled sites. There is a variety, the agglomeration is much more dispersed, and given that we have 1 billion people, it's not hard to have a city of 1 million people. Right? And so a lot of new cities come in which sort of drive this particular. And the reason I'm doing this is to motivate the fact that we need to look outside the usual places that we consider urban, which are these big cities, to see what exactly is happening to the transformation process. Right. And this gives you a sense of where the transformation is taking place in terms of census towns. This gives a sense that even in those places where they are, these are villages which have better sanitation, which means in-house toilets, most of them are septic tanks, than smaller towns, I said towns of 50,000 or below, in that particular state. So, and the reason I put that out is just to motivate the fact that when we think of quote-unquote urban, we're considering these small towns as urban because they're officially urban. But in some respects, a lot of villages across all these spaces are in some sense urban, at least in one characteristic, than those small towns. Right? So let me look at these small towns a bit more closely. The first thing is to ask, go back to the engine of growth story, how significant are these small towns? And if you look at when I say small towns, you look at million-plus cities and the rest of urban, what we find is, and this gives you the share by different categories of spending, what is the share of the small town vis-a-vis the million-plus cities. So if this was 100, then it would basically be the equal size of the market in some sense. The big towns market and the small town market would be roughly of similar sizes. Turns out the small town is about 70% of the big town market. So still a pretty big market. Right? And their consumption structure is fairly similar to that of big towns. They spend on roughly similar things. Okay? So if you're thinking about an engine that's as big an engine out there, or at least 70% of that engine size is, you have like, it's a twin engine aircraft, you're not sort of using the second engine yet in some sense. But forget small towns, look at villages. What do villages look like? About 28%, now it's maybe a bit more given the last labor force survey, but let me stick to the census numbers. About 30%, 28% of our workforce in villages works in non-farm sector. About half the manufacturing workforce in this country is rural. Okay? So the rural farm equation is not a valid equation. So what I did, so this gives you a dark areas that you can see is actually which are majority, more than 55% of the workforce is non-farm. Districts with more than 55% of the workforce are non-farm. The light brown was where the more than 40, and this is where more than 25% is non-farm. So fine, they are non-farm, but what kind of non-farm are they? And REGA is non-farm, so maybe they just do construction. So we look at the structure of the non-farm workforce in rural areas. What do people who are not working on the farm look like? Right? Where do they work? And we compare that to the urban non-farm workforce. How many of them work in manufacturing? How many of them work in construction, services, structures, etc.? What do we find? There is a difference, sure. The green is rural, the black is urban. Those colors were chosen not consciously, but I think they do have some metaphoric value. As you can see, the rural workforce is not too different in structure from the urban workforce. 24.5% of the rural non-farm workforce is in manufacturing, a little less in urban. If you're looking even at things like modern services, that's about 11.4% and 8%. Construction, about 13% in, about 13%, 14.6% in rural areas, 10.4% in urban areas. Trade, 13% in rural areas, 18.6% in urban areas. So you do have a rural non-farm economy that performs very similar function, that looks and talks very much like an urban non-farm economy.
So these are census figures?
These are census figures. I should have those sources down, but yes. So the question, therefore, is, the answer could be very simple. We just use stupid definitions to describe rural and urban, and that's why we can't find any difference between them. And that, I think, there is some truth to that particular statement. But it also means that there is a kind of non-farm activity that is happening across India. Remember the left-hand side. This is where all this non-farm activity in rural areas, this is where it is happening. And when you see that stuff happening, you wonder, what is actually the spatial nature of this transformation that's taking place? Right? Getting back to small towns, we looked at, again, the percentage of households with piped sewers, the percentage of households with treated tap water. Right? This is 0 to 100. These are distributions of things which look like this, means very few households have piped sewers, which is true for almost all except towns. This is the town 500,000 and more, and this is the town which is 1 million and more. So if you walk into a town and you expect to see a piped sewer network, if it is not a town of more than 1 million, chances are you won't find one. At least has to be, with a town of 500,000, you have less than an even chance, but still some chance of finding it. Town of less than 500,000, forget it. Okay. The other side is water supply. We expect water supply and sewerage to go together. That story, however, is different. Almost all towns would have reasonable degrees of water supply, whether they're big or small. This thing over here is the small, less than 100,000 statutory towns. And this thing here, the only sort of thing which has very little water supply are census towns. They're not towns at all. for all administrative purposes, they're villages. Villages have tube wells. They're not supposed to have treated tap water. And they don't. So we are reassured in the way our governance is happening in this country, that we provide things to people that they deserve. Villages deserve tube wells, they get tube wells. Cities deserve tap water, they get tap water. But they don't, nobody, if you're a big city, you deserve sewage. That's the broad story of how we think about providing services in this country so far. At least we have empirically thought about providing services. So what do people do? They live there. We found out they work there. So in order to do that, they obviously have to make do. And this is what they do by, this is the investment in two-wheelers, across all size classes of cities to get around. Obviously, no public transportation in these places, so you have to invest in your own transportation. And this is the percentage of households with septic tanks. And if you go back to the previous graph and you saw all those greenish things right to the left, now you'll see those greenish things right, speaking to the right. People want sanitation. If the government won't provide it to them, they will. So fundamentally, that's what you're seeing. Now, how does this matter? If you have invested in your own septic tank, and the government now comes in and sort of lays an underground network and does various kinds of things and says, now, please give me 10,000 rupees to connect to this wonderful network that I have built. How would you react? Chances are, you'll tell them to go take a hike. Which is understandable. And therefore, the willingness of people to pay for public services depends on both the timing and the perceived reliability of public service that you're expecting to provide in these particular areas. Okay? So those are small towns, right? The periphery. So what we did when you're thinking about the periphery, how do you get around this specific story? So we took, this is part of the new stuff we're trying to hang around with. So since new technologies nowadays, lots of new things about using night lights as a reliable way, since people in our surveys lie all the time. They usually, hopefully, are not switching off the lights when the satellite is watching in order to generate bad data. We use night lights to figure out what exactly people are doing. This is across 8 cities. I'll take about 5 a little down the line. The 8 biggest cities of India. This is the core city urban local body. We then took a box of 10,000 square kilometers across these 8 cities. And we looked at, because each city has different boundaries and structures, instead of trying to understand how that stuff works, we just arbitrarily chose this 10,000 square meter, 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer box, and looked at all the other statutory towns in that particular box, the census towns in those boxes, and the villages. The most striking thing to me is the difference between what is there in the core city. And remember, these are all villages which are more or less in that particular box. It's roughly about an hour's commute from the big town. Right? So we dove a little bit. This is preliminary work that we've done in Hyderabad and Bangalore. we looked at a variety of not just night lights, which is here, but built up percentages, share of non-farm work, households with in-house water, motorized two-wheelers and piped sewers, and saw how exactly these things behave as you move out of the core city. And you see the sharp gradients that fall off, fairly sharply for built up, less so for non-farm work, quieter for in-house water. This is Hyderabad, this is Bangalore. Very sharp for piped sewer. Bangalore doesn't even begin to start. And broadly, this is about 20 kilometers from the structure. So by the time, in most cases, this one is individual, if you remember. This one, you have some service that's taking place. And this one, with about 20 kilometers from the city core, you're more or less losing most of the intensity of the city. So city lights do shine, but they don't shine very brightly, which means they don't illuminate too much of the periphery. Right? And then we said, okay, let's look at this nightlight story and see where it will take us. So one of the issues that we said before is about migration. What we did was we organized, the Asian Development Bank with whom we did some work, shared with us shape files for what they call natural cities, which is essentially cities defined by lights, about 300 such shapes across the country. We grouped those 300 shapes by intensity of their lights into 10 boxes, 10 deciles, and we put them up. So this is the proportion of population in those deciles. So more than half the population lives in these brightest cities, which is roughly what you see in these large, big megalopolises. And this then looks at the change in the population that took place across these structures going forward. A lot of this work was by Shumendra Roy, colleague here at CPR. And what you do find is, yes, the dimmer cities are losing population, the brighter cities are gaining population. But the pace is pretty slow. And given what you have seen here, it is not unreasonable that the pace would be that slow. We also looked at things like looking at, this is the ratio of the total, how brightly lit the core is compared to the total intensity. And this is the share of the core city population to the national city population. And what we find is, in some sense, if you have a brighter, relatively brighter core, you have a larger periphery in some sense, just an illumination effect. We also do have higher congestion. And this congestion index, again, is something that the Asian Development Bank put together. They used 10 points in each of these natural cities, got Google to tell them how long it would take to travel from one point to the other, at 3 points of time during the day, peak morning, peak evening, and 3 a.m. at night. And they calculate the ratio of travel times at peak to off-peak to generate a congestion index. And that's what we're using here. But all of that put together, what you do see at the ratio of the core intensity to the total natural city light is shifting to the left. The blue line is 2011, the red line is 2001, which means that the core, in some sense, is evening out. There's a certain degree of peripheral development that is actually taking place. There's an equalization between the core and the periphery that might actually be happening. And some of this stuff you can see also in the pattern of migration again. When you're looking at, this is the share of the periphery in total migration to an urban agglomeration. Here the periphery is slightly different. It is not in the same way that we're looking at the periphery and the lights. These are formal administrative peripheries. And this is the share of the periphery in total population, right? You'd expect these to be, if peripheries and the core receive the same amount of migration, this would be a 45-degree line. What you actually see is essentially this is the local migration that comes much more to the periphery, then the rural to urban migration, then the urban to urban migration, and then finally the long distance migration, which comes much more relatively to the core than to the periphery. So in a sense, we do have an idea, as Professor Kundu says, of exclusionary urbanization, where long distance migrants are presumably better equipped and essentially are taking a larger, bearing larger costs, come to the core, whereas the others go much more to the periphery, especially the ones who are locally coming in, right? Finally, I'm running out of time, so let me go this quickly. The next part of the story was the whole idea of sprawl and unthinking migration, unplanned structures, and going forward. And this is what gives you the, as you can see, huge growth in these Gurgaon, Noida, and in that particular area, Faridabad and Ghaziabad and the others. This gives you a sense of how it has changed from 1990 to 2015 across these cities that you just saw, these 5 cities. And what we did was to compare the increase in high density built up in the core city, the percentage of high density built up in the core city in 1975 to 2015 and 1995 to 2015. And here you have the share of increase in built up. So what we did is we took the core, we built a 2-kilometer buffer around the core, we took the highways, we built a 2-kilometer buffer around the highways, and then said how much of this particular growth took place within those buffers. And fundamentally, ballpark, about 40% took place outside, 60% took place inside. So in terms of quote-unquote sprawl, about 60% of the growth over this pretty long period of about 40 years, or if we're looking at 25 years, takes place within areas that you could have predicted. It is the immediate periphery of the urban local body boundary and along the transport corridors. So it's not as if this is something that you could not have anticipated, right, going forward. So what we learned is expansion is predictable and contiguous, and therefore you could have serviced those places going forward, but as we have seen earlier, you have chosen not to do so. And therefore essentially telling people that, look, you're building stuff in areas which have not yet been declared for urbanization, and therefore you must be penalized, is fundamentally because you don't wish to respond to what is perfectly natural human economic responses going forward. I will skip this particular structure, but except to point out this one slide that I always find very, we do accuse a lot of the story of having multiplicity of institutions as being a problem. Here it is the Delhi Jal Board, which is a single institution. This is the Wazirpur Barrage, and this is where the Najafgarh drain hits the Yamuna. And it stays like this all the way 400 kilometers downstream to Chakarpur, where the Chambal actually hits the Yamuna and starts flushing out this sewage that's generated here. So just having a single institution is not going to solve your problem going forward, right? These are all structures in that particular sense. Yes, I'm way over time, so thanks. There are lots of tidying up stuff that we can actually do going forward.